and welcome to Roll for Adventure. I'm Bren.
I'm Bonnie.
And I'm Trent.
And today we'll be looking at Dungeons and Dragons, probably the best known role-playing game out there.
Specifically, we're looking at the latest version of D&D, 5th edition. The books for earlier editions are still widely available, but if you were to walk into your friendly local game store looking to play, you'll most likely find 5th edition games.
In previous episodes of Roll for Adventure, you've probably heard us refer to traditional role-playing games more than once. When we use that phrase, we're usually talking about Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons and Dragons is such an important part of RPG history that it's become the standard by which other games are often judged.
But with that long history comes a lot of rules and complexities that are baked into the system. The game was originally based off a miniatures wargame, and a lot of the more technical aspects stay with the game to this day.
Thankfully, a key focus of 5th edition is streamlining all those complicated rules, and they've managed to do that pretty well without dumbing down the game.
Whether using the player's handbook or the freely available basic rules, new players should be able to work their way through character creation and the gameplay rules without too much trouble.
In fact, there's never been a simpler time to get into the game. The basic rules even contain some pre-generated characters, so you can use them while you're learning the ropes.
The default setting for D&D is the Forgotten Realms, a world full of magic and intrigue that originally drew a lot of inspiration from Tolkien, but has definitely become its own rich setting.
You can play a wide variety of classes, ranging from barbarians to powerful sorcerers, or even a kung fu monk.
There are classes to suit almost any playstyle, and there is a lot of customization that you can do as your character levels up.
While a lot of other games work better as one-shots or mini-campaigns, D&D really shines when it's used to play long campaigns that give you an opportunity to have your character grow and develop.
D&D does a really great job of giving a character interesting new options every time they level up. There's a world of difference between 1st level and 5th level, and you can take your character all the way up to level 20.
Yeah, there's a lot of depth to D&D, and you can spend hours poring over all the rules and variations. But when it comes to playing the game, everything usually boils down to roll a d20 and add a number.
This rule applies to everything, from combat to performing a ballad. There are a bunch of bonuses that get applied to different things, but the character sheet does a pretty good job of laying everything out for you.
Some have criticised D&D in the past for being too focused on combat and ignoring the role-playing, but it all comes down to who you're playing with.
I've had games that are just one fight after another, and other games that are just no combat at all. It's important to keep in mind that in the setting of D&D, you're playing as an adventurer, so combat is going to be part of that role.
And there's nothing to say that you can't bring role-playing into the combat. Some of my best D&D stories have come from crazy things players have done in combat because they were playing true to their character.
At the end of the day, your mileage will vary, but if you're looking for a fantasy adventure game, it's hard to go past D&D.
Well, that's a quick breakdown of Dungeons and Dragons. After the break, we'll go into the strengths and weaknesses of the game and give you our impressions. Stick around, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Roll for Adventure. We're having a look at the game Dungeons and Dragons. So guys, we've had a look at the core mechanics of the game, but how would you sum up the overall feel of Dungeons and Dragons?
I feel like it's got a really strong fantasy feel to it, but your flavour of fantasy can really change. Like, it depends on the setting. If you go with the default setting, it feels like you're playing a Tolkien game like Lord of the Rings.
I find D&D really captures the high fantasy medieval world. So you've got your elves and your dwarf armies, and the goblins are running over the hill, attacking the castle in this high magic environment. It's just it's really captured those elements in the game.
Dungeons and Dragons was my first, like most people, my first introduction to role-playing games. I went along to a session and watched other people playing it. So yeah, it's a long-standing game. Everyone hears about it.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we've grown up with, I suppose, and I think that's one of what brings it home to most people. You know, it's like I will always have D&D because I saw my brother playing it when I was a kid. You know, and it's definitely a staple that people have grown up on.
Yeah.
I find it hard to talk about role-playing games with people that aren't into role-playing games. But if I say, oh, I play Dungeons and Dragons, then everyone's like, oh, I've heard of that. It's just so well known, and it's such a common thing to have heard of.
It's a real good point of reference for people. So when you're explaining what role-playing games are to people, you can say, hey, you know D&D, and there's enough references in movies and TV shows that people know what you're talking about.
Don't feel like you're stuck in that Lord of the Rings kind of world. There are many different worlds you can play in. For example, there's an alternate world called Eberron, where magic is just an everyday thing and advanced technology exists.
Yeah, there's so many different options available for all the different campaign settings out there. You can still use the old materials. So for example, I absolutely love Planescape, but it really just finished up in the second edition of D&D. And it hasn't really carried through. However, it's quite easy to adapt those previous campaign settings. It's just, they're ideas, they're concepts, plot hooks that you can bring into your game. And look, even if you haven't found a campaign setting that doesn't really fit what you and your friends are really looking for, make your own world and just develop that. We've covered Microscope before. That's a really good world builder for bringing in ideas from all the players and getting that buy-in.
If you're interested in looking at 5th edition, something worth note is that there is a free copy online called the Basic Edition, and you can really get into D&D and have a feel of it, but without the complexity of too many rules involved.
Absolutely, and without the investment as well. You know, you can pick up a free PDF of all the rules that you need to get started, 4 classes, 4 races, and you can grab your friends and just play with that.
Yeah, you just need to get some dice and paper and pens and you're ready to go.
Now you might find that your friends want to play D&D, and really to run a D&D session you must have a dungeon master around the table.
Yeah, it's not like some games where you don't need that.
Yeah, this is not a GM-less game, so someone has to take that role around the table of playing the dungeon master. It might be useful to have a few games as a player first, just to get that feel for, you know, watch what the other DM does, you know, get a feel for how the DM, you know, runs the game and interacts with the other players before jumping in yourself.
But hopefully you're not pressured into doing it. I know I've tried to dungeon master Dungeons and Dragons and it's too complex for me. Like, I would need to spend a lot longer researching it. The maths is just a lot to take in.
Yeah, like a lot of people who enjoy playing D&D want to be one of the player characters. It's simple as that. So it can often feel like you're the short stick when you get stuck playing the dungeon master.
It can also be a lot of fun though.
It can be very rewarding, but also watching how other DMs you know, play their games as well can really improve your own craft.
So one thing to note about Dungeons and Dragons, it's really not suited towards one-shot games. And by one-shot we mean like just playing a one-off, never to play again a game. Whereas a lot of the other role-playing games we've talked about are great for that. Dungeons and Dragons really gets into its stride when you do a long-term campaign. You meet every week or every fortnight with the same friends and you just keep playing the same characters. Because in Dungeons and Dragons, it's all about leveling up your character. So it's built for that.
Yeah, and investing that time into the character and really seeing it grow and develop as your character levels up.
Yeah.
Now, don't think you can't play one-shots with D&D. At a lot of conventions that are around Australia, you can actually go and you can play D&D, because D&D is usually one of those ones that'll be available.
Well, even if you're on your own, you can rock up to your local game shop and ask, and the majority of game stores actually run Dungeons and Dragons encounters, which is regular games that you don't necessarily have to show up every single week for.
Yeah, it's this great sort of one-shot format that, you know, it'll piece together this living game that sort of ties all these one episodes together, but they can really stand alone as just that single episode.
So coming into Dungeons and Dragons, if you're a brand new player, try to keep in mind that you're going to be playing with a group of people and you're supposed to be working together. It's really frustrating if someone comes along going, I want to play this character, a barbarian, but I'm a lone wolf and I'm going to do my own thing. I mean, what's the point in you being there? Everyone needs to work together to tell the story.
You really want to see you know, team participation in the party and working together towards a common goal. You also might find that there's, with the concept of alignment or, you know, like good, evil, lawful, chaotic behaviours within characters, it's important to set those alignments on a similar vein for the entire party. Otherwise you're going to be having different goals to get to.
Yeah, it's the most frustrating thing in a game when one person's like, I'm lawful good, and another player's like, I'm chaotic evil, so I'm gonna go rape and pillage people, and the other character's like, no, we're not gonna do that. I mean, that just creates conflict that doesn't need to be there.
And that conflict is really not a part of building a great story.
It's disruptive.
It's very disruptive, and you just don't end up with a good playing session.
With everyone going into this with different skills, it's really important that those skills are utilised in different ways. I mean, I could be playing a fighter, and my job is to protect people. If Bren's rogue is always running off, then it's really hard for me to fulfil my role of protecting Bren.
And from a group storytelling perspective as well, to sort of timeshare off the DM and say, okay, half of you are participating in this encounter while the other guys can't participate, and then switching over, it just really slows down the game. I had an example of they were investigating a town, and a third of the characters were off somewhere, a third somewhere else, and so forth. And it took forever, and the players that were sitting out of that particular encounter couldn't put in their suggestions. Well, I guess the players were, but their characters weren't there. So by having all the characters in the party together, they experience the world together.
In indie role-playing games, players have a tendency to be equal, whereas in D&D, fighters have a tendency to have a really strong advantage at the beginning of the game, where wizards have more of an advantage later in the game. And so some players can get really frustrated with this, in that the player seems to lose power over time and the wizard just takes over and does everything.
Look, these classes definitely aren't perfectly balanced, but I kind of like that from a story perspective. Your sorceress is building up over time, and becoming a force to be reckoned with later in the campaign. With this edition as well, they've really gone to lengths to sort of hydrate the fighter characters and the other sort of ones that sort of peter out, and introduce new concepts later on, so that they keep, as they level up, they're still getting new abilities and bonuses, and just keeping that particular class interesting. I really feel that they've sorted out character creation in this current edition of D&D as well. Previous editions, you might be sort of flicking backwards and forwards, sort of finding little spots on throughout the player's handbook, but 5th edition has really nailed character creation.
I mean, there are still some points that you need to flick back and forward, but they're some of the more complex classes. I went online and I found that there's actually this flowchart you can get, and it leads you through character creation. And I realized that the book is set out the same way, that you can go through this flowchart and pick your attributes and pick your backstory and then pick your race and then your character class. And it's that step-by-step process that makes it really easy for new players to get involved.
Well, certainly, yeah, the player's handbook can be quite intimidating. Like, pick up a book this thick and you'll need to master this book to have a character in this game. Not really, just start at the beginning and you step through the chapters and sort out your character that way.
You guys make it sound easy, it's really not. Dungeons and Dragons is a game you're going to spend a whole night making a character on. In a lot of other role-playing games, yeah, it might take half an hour to work out what your character's going to do, but in Dungeons and Dragons there's so many options, and if you don't know what you're doing, it's good to talk to someone who does, because you can end up with, by spending the same points and doing the same things, you can end up with a weaker character just because you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, we've covered role-playing games before that the first session of play involves producing a character. Whereas D&D, you really need either a planning session or, when you're starting off a campaign, you've got to do this homework. You've got to come with a character ready. And I sort of find that a bit different and probably a bit difficult for new players as well.
Which is why some people tend to get into it and then go, oh, actually I wanted to play more of a fighty-fighty than a healy-healy, so I might change up my character. And you just ask the game master, hey, can I change my character? And then you spend another night redoing it.
Something else is that these are more guidelines than rules. It says so in the book. So if your character has like a bite attack, but you go, you know what, biting my opponent doesn't really make sense. I'd rather headbutt it. There's no reason you can't. Call that bite attack a headbutt and make the game yours.
Yeah, for example, like I noticed with 4th edition, there was shifters as a particular race in D&D, whereas when we moved into 5th, shifters are gone, which are werewolves. So I talked to my DM and just said, well, hey, I want to play a werewolf character, but there's not something mechanically there in the game. So we just discussed and worked out a backstory and some attributes for the character, which didn't really make it heavy or didn't change the game too much, but sort of definitely added that flavour back into our game.
If there's something you want to play but it's not available in the core handbook, what might be worthwhile doing is going to the publisher's website. They've started releasing some of the older stuff in the new 5th edition format, so you can play Genasi from Forgotten Realms or the Artificer from Eberron.
So a new thing in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition specifically is inspiration points.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying this new mechanic in this edition of D&D. You're really encouraging players to role-play their characters and rewarding them for doing so.
I'm really enjoying the new advantage-disadvantage mechanic. It makes it really easy for me to go, oh, well, everything's working for you, you've got advantage. Or, everything's conspiring against you, you've got disadvantage. And it's just that simple roll 2d20 and either take the highest or lowest, and that gives you that feel.
Yeah, it really simplifies gameplay and smooths out the game as well. Previous editions would just have, all these modifiers and you're doing maths and that kind of stuff, whereas just to say, throw in an extra dice, it really keeps the game moving. I really find that attitudes towards the sexuality and gender of characters within the game have sort of definitely evolved and progressed over the years as well. Previous editions, you'd have this male warrior defending, this defenseless princess and things like that. And they've really just torn down those barriers and just moved on, and you can play whatever gender or sexuality you prefer, and it's not binary either. You can have this fluid concept of just whatever suits your character and the role-playing within the game.
Yeah, I think they've really reflected this in the art. You look at the art and there's none of those, armoured thong sort of wearing warrior females. They're properly armoured, that would actually protect them.
Yeah, no more busty chainmail, but it's far more sensible these days, I suppose. Well, after the break, we'll be continuing with Dungeons & Dragons, so don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Roll for Adventure. Today we're looking at Dungeons & Dragons. Unfortunately, the publisher declined to be interviewed, so we're doing things a little bit differently this week. We're going to dig a little deeper and talk about some of the wider issues that are unique to the D&D community. So guys, let's talk about Edition Wars. Now this is a game that fundamentally has just grown over time and over the decades, that it's really spawned out into different versions.
Yeah. I mean, you hear people talk about what their favourite edition of D&D is. A lot of players, older players, will talk about their experiences with what's called the Red Box. The Red Box was a really early edition of Dungeons & Dragons. It had a lot of different rules, but it was also extremely punishing on players. One failed roll and your character would die.
And it's that live and die sort of behaviour in the game that really made it challenging.
It really spawned inventive players. I remember having to walk around with a long wooden pole so I could check for pit traps and that sort of thing.
I've played a couple of different versions of Dungeons & Dragons, and to me they're all fun. I'm not biased, but I have met a lot of players who are.
Yeah, in the community there are a lot of players that are very set in their ways and are really strict on a particular version of D&D that they enjoy playing. It's really interesting that some players, even now, sort of circle back to some of the really, really early versions of this game. The white box, for example, it's so difficult to play, I suppose, and to go back and play the original game as it was designed is just a really interesting concept.
I've got to say, I like later editions in that I get to say goodbye to THAC0. THAC0 was a really early system that made the maths very complicated to see whether you hit or missed another player.
Yeah, the really early versions sort of had the concepts of roll over, roll under. It's all been simplified now, so higher rolls equals better.
Part of that streamlining is that they've taken out things from other editions. So for example, in 2nd edition, when your fighter hit H level, they started accumulating an army. And that's something that I kind of miss from time to time, that I miss once they reach a certain level, they gain these followers.
When I first got into Dungeons & Dragons, I was brought up that it's just a role-playing game. You're just players sitting around telling imaginary stories. It's a bit of fun and it's very light. Then getting into the groups, getting into the culture, I heard rumours about people who actually thought it was cults.
Or satanic worship.
Satanic worship, you're going there to, you know, slay demons. And I think it got this bad reputation, but that's really coming away from it now. It's becoming more popular, so I've never seen any of that in real life.
There was a lot of stigma attached to a movie called Tunnels and Trolls featuring Tom Hanks. And it really implied that there was this deep unsettledness with D&D players, that they believed their characters were who they are, and they didn't have that separation of player and character. I don't feel like that was a thing that ever happened.
I also find when playing as well, there can be this social connotation that that we're all introverts or we're all awkward at socially interacting or whatever. But here you are, you're 8 players around a table discussing how you're going to achieve something in the game.
Yeah, it's actually really good teamwork.
Yeah, you're socializing, you're sharing the experience together. I find it a really rewarding experience.
So I also have noticed that Dungeons and Dragons, over the many years that it's been around, the culture and society has changed. It used to be the idea of single, unwashed men in sitting in a basement.
Yeah, Cheeto dust down there, Mountain Dew.
Yeah.
And that they didn't get out and didn't do anything else. But I've been to a lot of games in actually the game shop that we go to regularly. There's more girls now than guys in our group, and it's a really nice change. It's getting out there. It's becoming more popular, and it's not niche anymore.
Now, D&D has spawned a number of games off this, and it's really interesting to see how the community sort of spun out to not only different versions of D&D, but completely different games based on the core rules.
For example, when Wizards of the Coast said that they were making a new edition of Dungeons and Dragons and they were going to change things, this upset a lot of people. But a publisher, Paizo, stepped up and they released a new game based on the current rule set of 3.5, and they made a game called Pathfinder. Now, Pathfinders are a lot like D&D, but there's a few subtle differences. So as an example, Pathfinder has these really deep, complex characters, and it can be really hard for new players to understand that complexity. I mean, there are players out there that really enjoy that really finite detail, but they took that out in Dungeons and Dragons to make the play experience a little bit faster and a little bit simpler for those new players. Something you'll see a lot of when you go into a friendly local game store is little figurines. Now you can really use these to play the game, but they aren't really necessary. So have a look at what works for you.
Yeah, like players walking into the game store and grabbing the starter set, for example. It really describes combat as just, a theatre of the mind that, you're 30 feet away from the hobgoblin and, how are you going to attack from there? Are you going to run in or are you going to shoot your arrow? And you can really run through the combat in the player's minds. Or alternatively, you can run on the table as well, using a grid system and moving your miniatures around.
Any sort of system you use is okay, so long as everyone's on the same page.
Well, that's about it for this week. All that's left is to give our final ratings. To keep with our theme, we use a dice rating system on Roll for Adventure, ranging from a D4 to a D20. So Bonnie, what are you going to give Dungeons & Dragons?
Dungeons & Dragons is a classic. It's always going to be there for me. But it's not my favourite game of all time, so I'm going to give it a D10.
And Trent?
I really like Dungeons & Dragons, and I really like all its flavours. I really feel like there's a version of D&D out there for you. So in that case, I'm giving it a D12.
And for me, Dungeons & Dragons is the universal language of all role players. So, if you've got a group of friends that are interested in playing a game for the evening, D&D is a great spot to start. I'm giving it a D20. You can find more about Dungeons & Dragons on our website, rollforadventure.com.au. While you're there, you can find a video of this week's show, as well as exclusive web clips. So next week we'll be playing as cannon fodder as we take a look at Goblin Quest. See you then.